Hey, this is Mrs. Reichelt, and this next video we're going to talk about blood and the components of blood and what makes up that tissue and that sort of thing. So let's go ahead and get started. So blood is the only fluid tissue in the human body. It would be considered to be vascular. Remember when we were learning about tissues, we talked about some tissues or some connective tissues are avascular, meaning that there's no blood supply, but others are vascular. So blood, obviously, because there's a blood supply, it's going to be vascular. It is classified as a connective tissue. Because it's classified as a connective tissue, we know that it contains both living elements and also non-living elements. So the living elements are going to be things like the formed elements. Those are going to include red blood cells, white blood cells, as well as some other cells. And then the non-living matrix is going to be made up of plasma, which are really cell fragments. So that really wraps up the components of blood. So then we get to go down to how blood is centrifuged. So if you were to centrifuge blood, and basically what that means is if you were to take a little blood sample, so if this was a blood sample and we were to put it in a centrifuge, basically a centrifuge is sort of this circular like contraption. It's a little machine that you put blood into a sample, and then when you turn it on, it spins it around. It kind of reminds me of if you were to go to the fair and get spun around by one of the rides. That's sort of like being centrifuged. So what we find when blood is centrifuged is that the erythrocytes, or the red blood cells, sink to the bottom. They make up about 45% of the blood, and in a percentage known as the hematocrit. So the hematocrit is actually a really important thing to understand. What you'll find as we look at different blood samples is that if a person has a lot of water, meaning that they're really hydrated, their hematocrit number will appear to be lower, because the more water you have, it'll reduce the amount, or I guess the percentage of red blood cells you have in that little area. Whereas if you are really dehydrated, so you don't have a lot of water, you would expect that your hematocrit number would be higher. So when we look at case studies, there's going to be an average number that we're going to look for, but depending on whether that patient is hydrated or dehydrated, it will change their hematocrit percent. The other thing is that the buffy coat contains leukocytes. Leukocytes are white blood cells, as well as platelets. Those are cell fragments. And then the buffy coat is a thin whitish layer that's between the erythrocytes and the plasma. And then the last one is the plasma, rises all the way up to the top, and it makes up 55% of the blood. This ends up being kind of a big deal because the plasma is where we have a whole bunch of different nutrients. So water is contained in the plasma, a whole bunch of different salts, so potassium, sodium, magnesium, those kinds of things. We also have plasma proteins. I would say probably the most important one is albumin, which regulates osmotic balance. So we look at the amount of water in your blood has to do with the protein albumin. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then a couple of other substances found in blood are going to be things like nutrients and respiratory gases and waste and those kinds of things as well. So the major physical characteristics of blood, and sometimes I find that not all students know this. Most people know that if you look at the really oxygenated blood, it's going to be scarlet red. However, when you look at oxygen poor blood, or sometimes we call this deoxygenated blood, it's going to be a dull red, almost a brick red color, a really dark red. And most people tell me, well, Mrs. Reichelt, when I look at my veins, I was told that if I were to look at my veins, and I don't know if you can see mine, but if I were to look at my veins and I see that they're purple, so our deoxygenated blood is actually blue. And if you look at any textbook you've ever seen about blood or about the heart, you'll see that oxygenated blood is always shown as red and deoxygenated blood is shown as blue. And the reason they do that is just so they can be more clear on which ones are carrying oxygen and which ones are not. Really, oxygen is always, or I guess blood is always going to be red. It's going to be red due to the iron component. So we have iron in our blood. Iron is always red. Iron is never blue. So based on the amount uh, of oxygen you have, it changes the color. So blood is never blue. The other thing is the pH must remain about 7.35 to 7.45. Blood temperature is actually higher than the rest of your body. It's 104 degrees or 100.4 degrees, whereas your overall body temperature is about 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And then a healthy man, their blood volume would be between 5 and 6 liters, or about 6 quarts. And then blood makes up about 8% of the body weight. And then we go back to blood plasma. We showed that on a little table earlier. So 90% of blood plasma is actually made up of water. It includes a lot of dissolved substances, so things like nutrients. That can be in the form of sugar. I usually think of this as sugar, so we'll just put glucose, I think, C6H12O6. We're going to look at glucose there. Salts and electrolytes, so things like sodium, chloride. Respiratory gases are going to be things like oxygen and carbon dioxide. Hormones, this could be really any hormone that's running through your body. Plasma proteins, and then waste products as well, things like urea. Plasma proteins, I guess the most common one that we're going to talk about is going to be albumin. Alright, so we get to the plasma proteins specifically here, and we're looking at let's go just straight to albumin. So this regulates the osmotic pressure of the water in your body. And another one is going to be clotting proteins. Basically, when you start to bleed, you have to have these clotting proteins that will help you stop bleeding. So those are the clotting proteins that are found in your blood. And then the next one are antibodies. So antibodies help you protect your body from pathogens. Pathogens are any kind of foreign invader. So anything that shouldn't be there is going to be an antibody, and that will make up a part of your plasma proteins. Okay, and then the last part here is acidosis and alkalosis. So acidosis occurs when your blood becomes too acidic. That means that your blood is going to be anywhere below that 7.35. So if it's lower than that, it's going to be acidosis, whereas if it's higher than the 7.45, it'll become more alkaline, where your blood becomes too basic. In each scenario, the respiratory system and the kidneys help to restore your pH to normal. So that kind of wraps up our blood components. We have a whole bunch more videos on blood, and I will see you then.